The reason that when we formed up our portfolio that we had less than average risk but average return is something called correlation. Correlation is a statistical measure of the relationship between any two series of numbers. So for returns, it would be the returns of two stocks. Positively correlated describes two series or two stocks whose returns move in the same direction, and negatively correlated describes two series, again two stocks, whose returns move in opposite direction. And the correlation coefficient is a measure of the degree of correlation between the two series. And the correlation coefficient has a range from -1 to +1. Perfectly positively correlated describes two positively correlated series, say stock returns, that have a correlation coefficient of +1. So perfectly positively correlated is a correlation coefficient of a +1. Perfectly negatively correlated describes two negatively correlated series or two stock returns that have a correlation coefficient of -1. If we look at perfectly correlated series, so if we had two stock returns that over time, when one stock went up, the other stock's return also went up, and when one stock's return fell, the other stock return would also fall. So we call this perfectly positively correlated, and we'd have a correlation coefficient of a +1. Negatively correlated, perfectly negatively correlated correlation would be when one stock goes down, the other stock goes up. One stock goes up, the other stock goes down. And we would have a correlation coefficient of a -1. Now in practice, the average correlation between all stocks in the market, in other words, if you took the correlation coefficient of American Airlines and saw how it compared to all other stocks in the market and did that, come up with an average correlation coefficient for American Airlines, and then you repeated that for all other stocks in the market, you come up with a correlation coefficient of somewhere between 0.6 and 0.7. So most stocks are positively correlated with each other, and we don't see a lot of stocks that are negatively correlated with one another. Going back to our portfolio, the reason that we got less than average risk, less than average standard deviation, even though we got average return, was because the stocks in our portfolio were not perfectly positively correlated. So if we had stocks that were perfectly positively correlated, we could have 2 stocks, 3 stocks, 1,000 stocks, and we would have no reduction in risk. But if we could add stocks that were perfectly negatively correlated with each other, so if we would have absolutely zero risk. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, in the real world we don't see a lot of stocks that are negatively correlated with other stocks. But overall, to reduce risk, the best way to do that in a portfolio context is combining or adding to the portfolio assets that have the lowest possible correlation. So combining assets that have a low correlation with each other can reduce the overall variability, in other words, the overall standard deviation about a portfolio's return, but we would still get the average return of all the stocks that are in the portfolio. And we could also have two series that are completely uncorrelated, had a correlation coefficient of 0. That would be two series that lack any interaction and therefore have a correlation coefficient close to 0. One thing we could look at is, say, treasury bills compared with risky assets. No matter what happens, the treasury bill promises and it pays its return, whereas the stocks have a lot of risk and a lot of variability, so they tend to be uncorrelated. Low correlation is the key to diversification. Consider two assets, asset F and asset G. Now, if we were to plot across time on the horizontal axis, on the vertical axis we could plot the return, and then we have an average or expected return for our two stocks. So asset F, we can see how it moves, is quite a bit different than asset G. So we know that these two assets are not perfectly positively correlated. In other words, the correlation coefficient is not +1, it's somewhere less than +1. Because the correlation is less than +1 between these two assets, if we form a portfolio made up of these two assets, we're going to get the average return, but we will be getting less than average risk. So when we combine, for example, right here at this point in time, we have different returns. But when we combine them together, we get the return of the portfolio, which is simply the returns of the two stocks at that point in time. And we can see that we have much less variability in our portfolio than we do in either asset G or in asset F. We have much less variability. So let's take a look at the correlation of our 10 stocks in our portfolio. We can calculate a correlation coefficient, and you can see how this is done by opening the spreadsheet, and you can see the cells in there. So we can see that Apple has a correlation coefficient of 0.16 with Berkshire Hathaway. The one here is just that it's correlated perfectly with itself. It has a correlation coefficient of 0.37 with Caterpillar, 0.47 with Cisco, Google, 0.57. In fact, of all these stocks in here that Apple is correlated with in our portfolio, it has the highest correlation coefficient with Google, which kind of makes sense. Apple and Google would be somewhat similar. Very low correlation coefficient with Pfizer, for example, which kind of makes sense. Two different industries, two different categories, and a fairly low correlation with AT&T. Apple's average correlation with all the other 9 stocks in the portfolio is only 0.34. In fact, we get something similar if we calculate the average correlations for each of the other stocks. So when forming this portfolio, I intentionally looked at companies in different industries, which explains why the correlation coefficient is pretty low. If I was to look at correlation coefficients between companies in the same industries, I would see very high correlation coefficients. So this is the key to the diversification benefit that we saw. That reduction in the riskiness of the portfolio is caused by the low correlation, around 0.3, of these stocks with one another.